Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a show about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is April 7th. Today we celebrate a botanist who is honored by the genus for the spectacular baobab tree. We'll recognize the man who became a globe-trotting botanist and even a food spy, and ultimately introduced more than 200,000 plants to the United States. We'll hear some words from a poet, gardener, ecologist, and naturalist who celebrates his 251st birthday today. And we grow that garden library with a book about the pioneering herbalist Nicholas Culpeper. And then finally, we'll wrap things up with a fun little quote from an Iowa newspaperman that's very timely. But first, here's today's curated news. Today's curated garden news is from Apartment Therapy, and it was written by Anna Kocharian, and it's about one of my favorite topics. The title of the post is called The Plant Lover's Guide to Styling a Bookshelf. And if you've listened to the show before, you know that I absolutely adore bringing botanicals into the home and styling your home with all kinds of natural elements. Now, if you click on this particular post by Anna, you're going to see this amazing infographic, and it's right at the top of the post, and it shows a bookshelf, and it's got a bunch of plants on it, and then it has a lot of little tips. So I wanted to share those tips with you really quick, and then encourage you to follow up and actually check out this post for yourself. But here's what this graphic talks about in terms of adding botanicals to your bookshelf. So the first tip is to choose the right vessels for your plants. And here the suggestion is to choose a container that complements the plant and the surroundings. So if you think about your bookshelf and you think about the color scheme that you have going on in the room or the predominant vibe in the room, then you want to make sure that you have a container, a planter that complements what you have going on in that room. Now, I know I've made this mistake myself, not paying attention to those things. But what happens is I'll fall in love with a planter online or in the store. And then when I get it home, it's off. It just doesn't look right in the space where I put it because it just doesn't go with the room. It's a different color or the style is off. It's just not vibing with the room, with the space. Well, in that case, it ends up in the garage on the shelf above the basketballs. That's where I keep my little misfit container collection. And I try to limit myself each year to around a dozen. So I call out what I don't want anymore. And then I try to hang on to the ones that I really want to try to make work in a space, either back home or up here at the cabin. So I like to play and mix and match with them throughout the year. Now, another tip in this infographic is to add plants of varied shapes, sizes, and colors. And I couldn't agree more with this particular suggestion because, as many of you know, I turned my formal front room, my dining room and living room, into a botanical library. And as I was styling all of my bookshelves once they were installed, I just organically kind of discovered this tip for myself because including just one type of plant or just a handful of plants was, well, quite frankly, a little boring. And so adding a variety of plants really gave me the look that I was going for. So you're trying to add plants that have different colored foliage, different sizes, and different shapes. And that was really the ticket to giving me the look that I had always dreamed of for my own botanical library. Now, another suggestion in this post is to stack your books sideways and then set a plant on top of that. That's a great idea. It's a wonderful way to elevate the plant plant. I do that as well. And then another one that I personally love is to swap a bookend for a plant. Now, of course, if you're going to do this, you need to have a substantial container, something that's got a little heft to it, especially if it needs to serve double duty as a container and a bookend, because the last thing you want is for your books to push that plant over and have it fall off the bookshelf altogether, or another bad outcome would be to have the books fall on top of the plant and kind of smush your plant. That would not be good either. And finally, the last tip is to group your plants in threes. So kind of the same principle of how we design outside in the garden, where we group plants together in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, and 7s, because that's appealing visually. You'll do the same thing on your bookshelf. You'll group plants together in 3s because that just looks better. Now, the only other tip that I would add to Anna's wonderful infographic is to consider incorporating permanent stems or fake plants in with your real plants. Now, why do I encourage this? Well, if you think about where your bookshelf is located, most bookshelves are not placed in optimal living conditions for plants. Most bookshelves are on interior walls that are away from windows. And especially if you have a low light situation, then I say go with some type of permanent arrangement that you only have to rinse off in the sink every 6 months or so that you keep it dust-free and looking fresh. But definitely make sure that you're getting a nice variety of plants on your bookshelf, even if you're going the artificial route, because that is what's going to give it a layered or lived-in look and also make it feel very, very, very cozy. So, one of my little tricks before the pandemic was that I would always go to Pottery Barn and shop their permanent plant clearance, because they usually have these beautiful fake plants, but they're very, very expensive originally. And somehow the ones that end up on clearance are usually the most interesting. They have an interesting texture or an odd shape or something that people maybe initially passed by. Now, to my eye, I think they look fantastic, and I wait till they're way marked down. I like to wait until they're about 75 to 90% off, and then I buy some for myself, and I often go ahead and grab a few for my mom, who is kind of phasing out of having so many houseplants in her home. She's looking to have a little more carefree lifestyle, which I completely get, but often, even as you're making that choice away from having so many houseplants, there's part of you that regrets not having that lushness, that botanical vibe that houseplants provide, especially if you're used to having that in your home. And so I sent her a few of these cactus that I'd found on clearance over at Pottery Barn. And I have to say that they were such a day brightener for her. She found them to be especially enjoyable because she'd really never grown cactus indoors in her home. And so not only was this giving her the houseplant fix and the look that she wanted in terms of styling her home, but it was also something totally different, totally unique, something that was a departure from what she'd done in the past. And all of us can use a change from time to time, just something that's a little different and a little more exciting. Now, I don't want you to think that this is really all there is to Anna's post, because this article is really so much more robust than just this little infographic that I've shared with you. So if you get a chance and you're in the Facebook group for the show, search for the word bookshelf, and Anna's post is going to pop up. And then I definitely encourage you to give it a read, because it's really, really worthwhile. Lots of great tips in this post for styling your bookshelves with plants. It is just wonderful. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, have no fear. You have a standing invitation to join, and it is so easy to do so. All you need to do is head on up to the search bar where you'd search for a friend, type in the words Daily Gardener Community, and then request to join. And then I'll admit you into the group, and I can't wait to meet you there. It's time for today's Botanical History. Here's Botanical History for this day, April 7th. Today is the birthday of the 18th century Scottish-French botanist and naturalist Michel Adanson, who was born on this day, April 7th, in 1727. Michel created the first natural classification of flowering plants. In fact, the great botanist Jussieu adopted Michel's methodology to create his masterpiece called Genera Plantarum in 1789. And although today we think mainly of Darwin and Linnaeus when it comes to classification, these two men and others stood on the shoulders of people like Michel Adanson. Michel was the first person to question the stability of species. And when he saw breaks in patterns or deviations in nature, he came up with a word for it, and it's one we still use today. The word is mutation. One of the most profound experiences in Michel's life was the 5-year period that he spent living in Senegal, where he collected and described many new plants and animals. That experience provided the foundation for his most famous work, his 2-part book, Plant Families. It came out in 1763. In this book, Michel classified plants by evaluating a variety of plant characteristics in contrast to Linnaeus's more straightforward sexual system. Again, Michel's approach was revolutionary, and today it's called the natural system of classification. Carl Linnaeus ended up honoring Michel's contributions with the naming of a genus he called Adansonia, which features the spectacularly unique baobab trees of Africa, Australia, and Madagascar. The baobab tree is remarkable and memorable. It has a susical quality to it, and it's one of the most massive trees in the world. In Africa, baobabs are called the queens of the forest or the roots of the sky. And that last common name refers to a legend that tells how long ago, in a fit of anger, the devil pulled the baobab tree out of the ground, only to shove it back into the earth upside down, leaving its roots shooting up into the air. Although they seldom grow taller than 40 feet, and they're generally sparsely branched, the trunks have an astounding girth, and they can be almost 30 feet wide. And some of the largest baobab cavities have served as jails, post offices, and even pubs. Today, there is a massive baobab tree in Zimbabwe, and it's called Shadrach's Office by the locals. It was used as a safe by a famous poacher. He kept his ivory and rhinoceros horns in the baobab tree. Now, inside the enormous trunks of baobabs is something very special. They can store up to 32,000 gallons of water. So while the outer bark is about 6 inches thick, the inside cavity is actually spongy and vascular. And that's why animals like the elephants chew the bark during the dry seasons. They're trying to get to that inner cavity where all the water is stored. The baobab can indeed grow to be enormous, and carbon dating on some of the oldest trees suggests that they live to be over 3,000 years old. Baobabs go by many names. They're called the baobab, the baobab, the tebaldi, the bottle tree, the upside-down tree, that's one of my favorites, the monkey bread tree, and the dead rat tree, which is a reference to the appearance of the fruit. The fruit of the baobab looks like an oblong coconut with a brown, velvety, hard outer shell. But inside, the flesh is sweet, and it tastes a bit like yogurt. The baobab fruit contains more vitamin C than oranges, more calcium than milk, more antioxidants than blueberries or cranberries, and more iron than steak. Finally, the flowers of the baobab bloom at night, and they're bat-pollinated. And here's another fun fact about the baobab. The cooking ingredient, cream of tartar, was initially made from baobab seed pulp, but today it's mostly sourced as a byproduct of making wine. So that's the baobab. Now back to Michael Adanson, who in 1774 wrote his second masterpiece, which was an encyclopedic work that covered all the known plant families at the time. Sadly, this book was never published, but that book was clearly meaningful to Michael, and he requested that for his grave in Paris, he wanted a garland that was made up of flowers from each of the 58 plant families that he wrote about in his book. After Michael's death, all of his work, his papers, and his herbarium were treasured and regarded as an heirloom by his surviving family. And his descendants privately held his entire collection for over a century before they transferred everything to the Hunt Institute for Botanical Documentation at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the early 1960s. Now, the Hunt Institute was so energized and grateful for this magnificent gift that they republished Michael's book on plant families in 2 volumes, and they released them in 1963 and in 1964. And during the pandemic, I was able to source both volumes for my own personal botanical library, and I was thrilled, still am. And today is also the birthday of the globe-trotting botanist and food spy, David Fairchild, who was born on this day, April 7th in 1869. In terms of plant exploration, David hit it out of the botanical park. He was single-handedly responsible for the introduction of more than 200,000 plants to the United States. And his introductions included things like pistachios, mangoes, dates, nectarines, soybeans, and flowering cherries. Now, prior to David's work, the classic American diet was a little meh. It was mostly meat and potatoes, with maybe a little cheese thrown in. Now, in terms of food history, David not only enriched lives, but he also changed diets with his fantastic collection of fruits and vegetables. In conducting his work, David traveled around the globe numerous times, and there are some fascinating accounts of his adventures. In 2019, David's story and contributions intrigued the author Daniel Stone so much that he wrote a spectacular biography of David called The Food Explorer: The True Adventures of the Globe-Trotting Botanist Who Transformed What America Eats. And it's really an awesome book. Now, before I close out this tribute to David, I wanted to share some of his legacy with you. For instance, Without David Fairchild, the Washington Mall would not have the beautiful Japanese flowering cherries. That was thanks to David. And while plants like kale seem to be a relatively new phenomenon in gardens across the country, especially over the past decade, it was actually David Fairchild, not Trader Joe's, who brought kale to America. And if you're a Chipotle fan, keep in mind that it was David Fairchild who brought the avocado to America as well. In fact, David loved the avocado so much that he wrote, "The avocado is a fruit without rival among the fruits, the veritable fruit of paradise." Now, looking back over David's life, it's clear that he had a few lucky breaks that helped change the trajectory of his life. For instance, on his very first collecting expedition, he ended up meeting Barbara Latham, who ended up funding many of his adventures. And in 1905, he fell in love and married Mary Ann Bell. His father-in-law was none other than Alexander Graham Bell, who, along with his wife, also enjoyed gardening. Finally, the next time you're in Florida, be sure to stop by the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden in Coral Gables. It's filled with many of the plants that were collected by David Fairchild, and of course, it's named in his honor. And I thought I would end this little segment on David by sharing one of his quotes with you. David wrote, "I have always liked horticulturists, people who make their living from orchards and gardens. They have the patience and fortitude to gamble their lives and fortunes in an industry which requires infinite patience, which raises hopes each spring and too often dashes them to pieces in the fall. They're always conscious of sun and wind and rain, must always be alert, lest they lose the chance of plowing at the right moment, pruning at the right time. The successful horticulturist spends much time alone among his trees, away from the constant chatter of human beings." It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's unearthed words come from the English Romantic poet, ecologist, and naturalist William Wordsworth, who was born on this day, April 7th, in 1770. In his Dove Cottage garden, William grew roses and honeysuckle, red-flowered runner beans and parsnips, gooseberries and rhubarb, lettuces and spinach. William even built a little hut for himself in the garden, and he lined the inside of the hut with moss, quote, "like a wren's nest." And on February 25th, 1797, William wrote, "I have lately been living upon air, and the essence of carrots, cabbages, turnips, and other esculent vegetables, not excluding parsley, the product of my garden." It was William who wrote, "How does the meadow flower its bloom unfold? Because the lovely little flower is free down to its root, and in that freedom, bold." William Wordsworth also loved daffodils. He wrote, "If one daffodil is worth 1,000 pleasures, then one is too few." It's no surprise then to learn that William wrote the mother of all daffodil poems, and it starts out this way. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." This wonderful poem ends with this verse. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Finally, it was William Wordsworth who wrote, "He is the happiest who has the power to gather wisdom from a flower." It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Heal Thyself by Benjamin Woolley. This book came out in 2004, and the subtitle is Nicholas Culpeper and the 17th Century Struggle to Bring Medicine to the People. In this book, Benjamin brings us the first full biography of the great botanist and herbalist Nicholas Culpeper. Culpeper was a nonconformist, and he was also a business owner. 10 years before his death, he found a spot in East London, and he opened the doors to his own apothecary. Culpeper catered to the needs of the people. He took medical books that were written mainly in Latin and translated them into English. The masses were grateful. However, the medical and academic communities frowned on Culpeper's work since they had always enjoyed a monopoly on training doctors and reserving medical information for their paying students. And I love what Publishers Weekly wrote about Benjamin's biography of Culpeper. They wrote, Culpeper is best known today for Culpeper's Complete Herbal, a comprehensive listing of English medicinal herbs, along with directions on their use. Still in print after more than 350 years, the Herbal is, in Woolley's words, one of the most popular and enduring books in publishing history. And it is perhaps the only non-religious book in English to remain longest in continuous print. In a time preoccupied with empowering patients and making information available online, this tale has particular resonance. This book is 416 pages of the fascinating story of a rebellious botanist and doctor who changed medicine forever. You can get a copy of Heal Thyself by Benjamin Woolley and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $5. And that's a steal. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Today is the birthday of the editor and publisher of the Mason City Globe-Gazette newspaper, W. Earl Hall, who was born on this day, April 7th, in 1897. Hall wrote one of my favorite quotes about spring, and I thought I'd end the show with it today. He wrote, "Science has never drummed up quite as effective a tranquilizing agent as a sunny spring day." Isn't that great? Well, I hope you have some sunshiny days this spring. And I always say it's the best time of the year for gardeners. A whole growing season is before us, and the garden offers limitless possibilities. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota, with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, and Eric Begay. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook. and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.